Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to our 18th TAQELAH meetup. So we have a very special edition today. And given the current situation, we are not doing a physical meetup, but we use the opportunity to do a live webinar sharing, which is something that we've been having in the pipeline for a long time. And okay, sorry, there was a delay. So yeah, we're doing a live webinar, which gives, for one, more people the opportunity to join, which is great. And it also gives us a chance to invite speakers from outside Singapore. So I'm very honored to have Greg Paskal share with us today. I'm sure most of you are familiar with his work and come across him before. So he's joining us from all the way from Nashville, Tennessee. So very pleased to have him. And he will share about METS, Minimal Essential Testing Strategy today. Thank you, Greg, and the stage is all yours.
That's great to be here. I want to just do a quick check to make sure you can see the video and you have a good audio signal.
Yes, both are fine.
Excellent. Well, it's great. This is my first international webinar for sure. It's an honor to be here to speak with all of you with the meetup today. I get this chance to do this with Joe Colantonio quite often. For some of you may be familiar with the Automation Guild or the Test Guild that he's put on for quite a few years, and lives in Tennessee now as well, not too far down the way from where I'm at. So today I want to share with you this test methodology called METS, stands for the Minimal Essential Test Strategy. And I'm going to give you a little bit of the backstory, and we'll go through the talk. This is actually a talk I first gave at the, if some of you are familiar with the Star West and Star East Conference, they're big QA conferences here in the US. I got to give this talk probably close to 16 or 17 years ago when I first developed this methodology. And it's been shared in many places from there. We use this exclusively at my company now that I work for, and it's used all across the world at many companies. It's a great tool for enhancing existing test plans and test methodologies already in place. So I'm hopeful that you'll find that you can use it in the same way, that it can enhance the work that you're doing, or maybe come in place where you're struggling with a good test methodology and can replace that and be a fresh start for you. So let's jump in here. I want to tell you a little bit about, in 2001, I joined this company. It's very popular here in the United States, that was famous for late night photocopy sessions, especially with college students. And it was the first time I had been given the role officially as a quality assurance engineer. And to be frank with you, I knew nothing about quality assurance, but I was really good at breaking things. I had been testing things for quite a long time in my work, even in the 1980s, working in the aerospace. I was working as in the world of automation back then, writing code in assembly language on Apple IIs, if you can imagine those days. But to actually have a role as a quality assurance engineer, this was the very first time. So I live here in Nashville now. I work for a great company called Ramsey Solutions, and I work for a company that helps people learn how to get out of debt. And I work for a great guy named Dave Ramsey, who has a radio show that's daily, and some of you may have even heard of him. Now, the minimal essential test strategy is really simple, and it's a very effective test methodology, and you can implement it right away. That's the thing I like about it. Regardless of the size or the maturity of your testing organization, you can get it up and going pretty quick. We're going to cover three things today in this talk. We're going to go over some basic METS concepts and how to get started building your own METS tool, and some more advanced concepts for those of you that might already have something like this in place. and you're wanting to maybe take it to the next step. At the end of the presentation too, I'm going to share this a website, but I want to share it with you now as well, and that's metstesting.com. And you'll find a similar presentation as the one we're going to talk about tonight. And you're going to find all the resources free to download, including worksheets and things like that, that hopefully will help you. So let me go ahead and see if everything's working here well with my presentation. So, okay, good, looks good. So let's begin with this story, and this is going to be familiar with many of you. So it's kind of the day in the life of a QA engineer. I get this phone call, the phone rings, I pick it up, and it's my web developer. And I'm like, what's going on? And he says that he's made a small email change. And with that, it's affected a few of the pages on our website. I said, oh, well, how many pages did you make the change on? And he said, well, it was just the press releases. And for a moment that sounded small until I realized we had, countless press releases. I said, aren't there at least 40 of those? And he said, no, actually there's 48 of them. And I've changed it on all of them. And on top of that, he said he needed it by noon. And again, that's probably familiar to many of you, where you get a really short deadline and you have to, test this thing and get it, out on production as quick as possible. So it's common, and it started to lead me down the road of what eventually turned into METS. But I realized at that point, I got to come up with some kind of strategy for that when that happens again. So that's kind of how it happened. And that phone call really changed everything for me that day. There's some common challenges that we all face as QA engineers. There's frequent changes that show up at any time. There's generally a minimal amount of time for the sufficient test coverage that we need to do. And oftentimes there can be these really unrealistic expectations of what can be done in the amount of time given. Very common in our trade, in our craft, is it's thrown over the wall and said, hey, this has got to go live, by noon today, or, hey, it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon on a Friday, and someone says, this has got to go live before the weekend. So I was definitely living in that world. So if you go back to that simple email change that we were talking about, the common perception for most folks that might not be in quality is the email link working? That's all they're thinking is, you click this and what's the big deal? But we're starting to think of things like, yeah, is the link working, but does it launch the email client? Is it working on, as many environments as possible? Is the email recipient correct? Has anything else been impacted by the change? So something as small as that someone might look at and say, this shouldn't just take you more than a minute. Let's see. I just noticed a note down here. I want to make sure everybody can see the slides. It looks like they can now. Okay. Something like that, it seems like it's so simple, is actually going to be a bigger deal for us as QA engineers. It's just the way we're trained. So we tend to ask, the why and the what and the how all the time. And that's just the way that we're wired. And any of you that have, spouses and children, what you might find out is you bring that kind of thinking to your home as well. And next thing you know, your family starts looking at things through the eyes of a test engineer. So I want to tell you another little story that really reinforced to me that I had to come up with a plan. And there was this one time there was a $5,000 giveaway. It was something our company was doing. We had a web page that said our company was running this special contest where we're giving $5,000 away. And to enter the contest, a person just needed to call a 1-800 number, very common here. That someone might call this number, they'd enter into this contest, and so on and so forth. Well, guess what? I thought, I wonder if anybody's tested this phone number. So I decided I'm going to call it. It can't hurt anything. And so I dialed the number, and this woman answered the phone, and she said, hello. I expected it to be, hello, this is something from, such and such company, but it was just a simple hello. And I shared with her that I was checking a phone number that was going to be part of a big contest before long, there would be thousands of people calling this number. And I'm sure happy I did, because at that moment I found out that we had the wrong phone number. We were able to catch it before we published it. And, the moral of the story there is a good tester, typically tests more than what's, simple, low hanging fruit. They have this capacity to think outside the box. And that's really what makes the field of QA, I think, interesting for us. So, with the $5,000 giveaway, we were at least able to identify, the problem ahead of time before we published this whole thing. And, and we're, seriously embarrassed by publishing this wrong number, and this poor person was going to receive all these calls. So as a new QA engineer, I was really enjoying the world of testing, but I also realized that I needed something to help with the chaos of these things getting thrown over the wall. Now, if anybody knows much about me, they know I'm an organizer. I have boxes for everything. Just ask my wife. There's a box with a box with a box inside of it. And I started to apply that same principle in the way I started thinking about testing things. So I took out a yellow sheet of note paper, something similar to this. And on it, I just started to write down, the next time this thing gets thrown over the wall like this, at least test this thing. And so on and on it went. And eventually it turned into something that looks similar like this. And this is actually a METS spreadsheet that you can get on that METS website that I told you about, metstesting.com. This is one of the earliest ones I created. I call it a physical test grid, and it actually to this very day can be used for web testing. And I think I've got some enhancements on it, but it's simply an Excel spreadsheet that you can continue to enhance. But what was cool is it started with just a simple yellow tablet, and it transitioned more and more to this formal document. And it was really interesting too that I would continue to doodle on it, new ideas, the things I wanted to add, and then maybe once a month or so I'd go and kind of formalize it in the document. So it was meant to be kind of a living document. So now I had this solution called the Minimal Essential Testing Strategy, or METS, as we called it for short. And the METS, the idea of it is that it gives you a strategy to get essential testing done within the time that you're given. How many of you get stuck in this rut where I call it the testing miracle? You get stuck in this idea that you feel like you have to test everything. Well, we know that's impossible. So our whole role in the work that we do is to reduce risk. And so if we're given an hour or a day or a week, we're going to test to a different level. And this strategy really adapts well to that. METS addresses the myth that QA and the testing world, it addresses this idea that you can't test everything. And so have a plan. You're going to see that METS also, it gives you a tool for awareness. And actually, I love to show this to my devs as well, because they'll identify maybe gaps in there, or they'll start to use it before they'll send it over the wall, maybe even to do some preliminary testing. So METS really is this strategy being prepared before the work gets thrown over the wall, that you have some sort of plan in place. And it requires preparing for the inevitable, product getting thrown over the wall that we're so used to. Like most things though, this isn't a silver bullet. It's not, a product. It's something that you buy off the shelf. When I created it, I really wanted it to be something that everybody would have access to, kind of like an open source, but in a process instead of a piece of software. It's not an automation process, although we've found it enhances the things that we determine are good automation candidates quite a bit. I might even cover that later on in the talk if we have time. And it'll meet many of your needs. It's not going to meet all of them, but it will complement an existing QA strategy. So think of it like a tool that's going to go into your QA toolbox, tool belt. And it's also an exceptional tool as a guide for exploratory testing. So again, if you carve out maybe 25% of your time for exploratory testing, you can use this as a guide to go and hit up things that are really important as part of your application. Let's go over some of the foundational METS concepts. Now, the first one here, and I've actually started to switch these around. So, but I'm going to cover them in the way of the presentation here, and I'll tell you why I've started to switch them. So the first part of the foundation is the concept of how to do things with identification. You know, as humans, we identify things all day long. Most of us view things from different perspectives, and the two most common perspectives I found helpful when it comes to working with METS are to look at things from the physical and the functional perspective. Um, so, for instance, I think I've got my next slide here. If we look at this van for a second, um, there are a few physical aspects of this van. So, for one, it's got tires, it's got some lights, it's got some glass. These are just a few of the physical characteristics that make up a van, a minivan like this. Now let's kind of change the perspective. Like we're looking at it from a different context and we're thinking about what it does instead of the individual specific things that it has. Functionally, we know that this van has acceleration, it has the ability to stop, it has some lighting capabilities and of course cooling so that it doesn't overheat. All I've done, grabbing a drink of water here, all I've done is I've just changed the perspective of how I'm looking at the same minivan. And uh, I've actually started to flip the way I start to look at this when I build my METs. So I'm starting to look at things more functional versus physical. When I initially started, I really started from that physical perspective, which is why the first METS sheet got created. The one that I told you earlier is great for web testing. They complement one another real well, but folks have a harder time sometimes looking at things functionally. They have an easier time looking at them physically because I guess maybe it's more tangible and they can look at it. Functional is a little more abstract, but it is an important concept to get your mind around the functional aspects of your site. Another foundational concept around METS, and it's the second one, is that all actions can be prioritized. The prioritization is what's most important to get done right now versus the least important or the low prioritizations. So, you know, if everything is going to be equal to your application, some things are just going to be more important. Your authentication into your app is going to be more important than the About Us page, let's say. And you'll find that sometimes you're going to wrestle with, doesn't everything seem like it should be a critical? Well, it can't be. Remember, the whole idea of METS is that it gives you a strategy when you're given an hour, you know, a day, a week, a month to test, that you can adjust things by the most important to the least important. So let's look at prioritizing an aspect of this van again. Yeah, let's look at the tires to begin with. So we're going to prioritize that this is the physical side of it, not the functional yet. That maybe the most important thing is that there's 4 tires on this van. I would say that if it doesn't, we don't even need to test anymore. We know something very fundamental to it's broken. The next thing we might consider is the condition of those tires. Are they in good condition? Are they bald? Not that any of us have not done that, but we know the importance of good condition here in Tennessee. We have snow and ice, things like that. So having good tread wear, good tread on there, it makes good sense. Maybe the next bump down from that is the pressure, and that would be at the medium level. And then last but not least might be balanced tires. Heck, you can drive around quite a long time, I found, without balanced tires. It's not great ride all the time, but you can get away with it. Now we're going to look at this same exact van, but we're going to look at it from the functional perspective instead. So let's consider, remember, we just looked at tires. Now we're going to look at the stopping aspect, the function of stopping. So the most critical thing, of course, is that it completely stops. Just like if we had a functional piece of authentication, we'd say the most critical test is I can authenticate into an application. A high level would be, can we stop in the expected time frame? So yeah, it's really, really important we can stop. And I would say it's pretty darn important that we stop in the expected time frame people expect the vehicle to stop in. Next might be under what conditions can we stop? And last but not least, does the emergency brake work? So imagine if I've only given 10 minutes to test this van. I'm going to darn well make sure that it stops and it does a couple basic things. But if I'm given maybe a week to do it, or maybe a month, I'm going to go through every aspect of stopping that I can, right down to the emergency brakes. So let's transition now from these foundational concepts to what it takes to get a METS grid built. So kind of the starting aspects of it. So there's really two fundamental steps. And again, I have started to find out that by flipping these and doing the second one first and the first one second, works better for some folks. So be flexible on that. This methodology is still evolving. We're actually still working on it. And I teach this to my team every day. We did today as well. So we're continuing to learn effective ways for testers to get even more usage out of it. So if you're going to get started with your first METS, by the way, I think I've got some blank worksheets that are on that metstesting.com website. But if you know how to use Excel, this isn't going to be hard for you at all to create. It's very basic. The first step is you're going to create a physical test grid. The physical test grid simply contains the touchable components of your application. So that's going to be the pages, the graphics, the forms, the buttons, things like that you can literally touch within the web page or the mobile app, or we're even starting to apply this to APIs. So think about your endpoints and maybe parameters and things like that you can interact with. So beginnings of a physical test grid look something like this. I used Microsoft Excel. You see, I've kind of simplified the layout here just to show what it looked like in the beginning. And it's kind of this 10,000 foot view that I start with, and I write down all the obvious things. It is a living document. So I'm sorry, I'll switch the slide there real quick, but I want you to see if you can see my cursor here. With the categories, I started thinking, well, the most obvious thing, this was when I first started working with testing web apps, is this thing has got pages and graphics and forms and links and text and printing was part of it. And there was some security. Even here in the early days, I started to blend in even some of the functional aspects of it. This was some of the very first usages of it. But I started to think of these categories and just put them down. It's probably good to also mention at this point in time that one of the more common mistakes I see happen when people begin to build out METS is they try to build the whole thing in one shot. I have found it's much more successful to start the process and then just set it there on my desk or make it easy to get to on your computer, and then just add to it as time comes up. Let it be a living document. That really seems to be the better way. Every time I've seen it done on one shot, it tends to be over complex and not as well focused. Okay, so again, we're working on a physical test grid, and I was looking at things like these images and adding it to it. I was starting to put some buttons down, even started thinking about facts. That page might have had a form and some links, and I continued to add them into the grid like this. So as it evolved, I said, well, when it comes to pages, one of the critical things is that the page completes loading and that the graphics and text and other elements are in the correct position. I know this sounds really simple, but any of you have tested and are under the gun for an hour, you know how your brain can sometimes check it at the door. And so I find a checklist like this really helpful, especially when they become a little more obscure than just, is the page loading, but looking for scaling problems or those sort of things, graphics. This is a great time to catch those sort of things. And what's cool is you Excel experts out there are going to love, modifying this. I love working with Excel, and I'm really into Google Sheets now as well. And it's really fun to go in here and enhance this for your team, even customize kind of the look and feel for something that your team would enjoy using. So this is my completed physical test grid. This is a sample of what it looks like. We still use this one, believe it or not, even now. This has become a universal web testing METS grid that we use in our company, and it applies to all kinds of websites. It doesn't have to apply to just a specific product, and that's what's so valuable about sometimes building out the physical ones, is they tend to be universal. You could have one of these for general mobile testing or web testing or general API testing. Okay. So as it's evolving, you want to keep writing down the critical tests over time. Again, try not to write them all down at the same time, but let it come as you're naturally using the application and you're in there testing. Build it out a little bit at a time. And I even like to laminate this thing when it's done. Once I get it in a pretty good shape, and I just stick it up with some Velcro on my cube wall, and it's right there, and I could just rip that thing off and use it real easy. One of the interesting facts I discovered while creating METS was I started to slice and dice the data. Now, by trade, I'm an automation engineer. I've been writing automation for quite a long time now, and I still do this with data. But way back here, when I first started to work with this tool, with the METS tool, I started to do the same thing. And I thought, what happens if I look at this data from a different perspective? And so I just literally laid it out in a different format. And I decided, you know what, I'm going to add 2 more columns, and I'm going to add a column called time required and the potential severity if this test case didn't pass, or in this case, this test element didn't work as expected. And so I was able to enhance the tool by taking the same information, kind of flipping it in another orientation, and just adding these 2 columns. My manager at the time thought this was fantastic, because now it gave him a way to even look at it and say, how much time was I estimating to look at these sort of things, or how long did it take, to do these sort of things. We were able to obviously use Excel and add some more formulas and come up with an estimation model that worked pretty good with it as well. So I'm going to pass on a book that I love, and it really feeds a lot into the way I think about things. Those of you that are readers, I'd like to suggest a book called The Innovators by Walter Isaacson. This is a kind of required reading for folks that join my team. It really gives an insight to the way I think as a quality engineer. And this is a great example of applying it, which is once you build something, there are going to be new areas you're going to discover and find once you build the basic kind of skateboard, as we sometimes refer to it. So you build this basic product, in this case, a test strategy like this, knowing there's more to discover down the road. That book has really helped me. It talks about guys like Jobs and Edison and others who applied similar principles. And I just learned from those principles and apply them now, even in manual testing and in automation. So, all righty, let's keep going here. So that was our first step. Now our second step, where, like I said, sometimes these get done in the opposite order, and you might decide to jump in with physical. Let's see, someone's got a question out there. Are categories in physical test grid generalized to project? That's a great question. Or it has derived based on requirements. It can actually be both, but when it comes to the physical, I tend to tie it to the technology. So good question. We're starting to find that the categories really tie well to test suites. So those of you that are familiar with the idea of test suites, sets, test cases, and even test steps, we're starting to find a good correlation between suites and categories. Doesn't always work that way, but about 80% of the time, it's a great fit. So let's look at step 2, to create a functional test grid. So this is from the functional perspective. It contains things like business processes and the things that are necessary to use the application. You can derive this from the requirements doc, user guides, those sort of things when you're creating these grids. So I think I took a typical maybe an e-commerce site or something that's a shopping cart site when I initially built this out. Again, it's from the functional perspective. So when I started thinking of the categories, now I'm not so much looking at buttons and fields anymore. Now I'm thinking about, what does this thing actually do? So I had to start looking at it from the 10,000 foot level. So I don't want to get too close to it. Step back and say, what's the purpose of this application? I coach our team members in this almost every single day. And I ask, why is this built? It might be a CRM, or it might be a blog that we've got, or whatever. And it can be hard when you work on a project for a long time. You get so deep into it, so kind of interwoven with the project itself. It's sometimes hard to step that far back. So it's not even a bad idea to bring someone who has not a lot of familiarity with the product and have them sit alongside with you and say, well, doesn't this connect customers with providers? And sometimes a QA engineer will even be offended by such a simple explanation of an application they've poured all their heart and soul into. But it's really great to have that secondary person there. By the way, these can be great training tools for new QA team members as well, and we use them in a similar sort of fashion. We also centralize all of these on our SharePoint, or if you've got a wiki or a tool that you have, they're fantastic to have them named out there by product, so that if somebody is out sick or that sort of thing, they're very easy to get access to. Okay, there's another question. Someone says, is METS effective for a proof of concept or MVC project? I'm assuming they're meaning mono-view controller product, especially when things keep changing. Great question. I think if you can keep the METS focused on maybe the technology solution, so generalize it around, is this an e-commerce solution or something like that? That's probably the way I would approach it. Yes, we do tie these to specific products, but you will find that they translate so well from product to product that they can be universal. And we've even started to name them universal METS. So we have universal for email testing. We have a universal one for web now. We're working on a universal METS for, they gave me a minimal viable product. I thought the MVP in the question was mono-view controller. That's my iPhone dev guy coming out. Anyway, so if the product is changing a lot, I would say you're still pretty safe keeping it at a high level. You'll find you're going to get a lot of reusability out of it. You're probably going to use the same discretion you would with test cases. I find that METS is a great tool for the manual test engineer who really knows the product well, that sometimes they haven't got the test cases fully documented yet, but they can use the critical high, medium, low test that they put down, the description of the test, which will probably be eventually the test case name, as enough to get them to do some exploratory testing there. So yeah, I do think it works well in that space. That's a good question. So here, this is what kind of building, once I've built out a functional test grid would look like. And you can see that now, instead of me having buttons and other things to the left-hand side under category, I've now got these functional categories called account and shopping cart, and I've created these critical tests around it. So think about this METS grid right here. If you had 2 e-commerce solutions, you probably could use this exact same METS grid. You might have to tweak it a little bit, but wouldn't it be cool if you already had 50% of the test strategy done, because this was generic enough that it could go across different clients, e-commerce solutions, or something like that. So it's really valuable if you're working across maybe multiple clients and you want to create a very general one. Let me look at my notes here. Yes. Someone's asking, we can do all QA at the end. Oh, great. Yeah, we're going to do some questions and answers at the end so we don't have to break kind of the flow. So if you've got any other questions, kind of hold them, hold off for now, and we'll cover those in just a few more minutes. I think I've got just about a handful more slides to go through. You remember how I kind of flipped the data before? Well, I've done the same thing here with the functional test grid, and you can see I got some of the same wins out of it. So I'm able to say time required, 10 minutes to for relog on and that sort of thing. Each of these time required is really helpful creating an account. Again, my QA manager loved this idea that now we can begin to do some estimation, and I think you'll find that's really helpful as well. And we're going to cover, I think, some more of this in the advanced section, which we're about to get into. So some of you, maybe like me, can never leave enough alone, and you're probably already thinking what you could do with METS to get more out of it. And I love that. I think us engineers are wired that way as test engineers. I'm always asking questions. So now what? Usually this shows up somewhere in the middle of the night and I wake up and I'm like, oh my gosh, I hadn't thought about that. This is something brand new I can do with this. It's possible if we take that next step. So let's talk about a few advanced METS sort of things. So we were talking about this just a minute ago, but there, you could break down the data that you would put in your METS grids in a way for estimation. And I started to think about direct testing, um, things that are related or might have been impacted by the change, and did just my general regression testing. So it's just a way of kind of looking at my application and saying, if I could go ahead and apply a budget to things that were directly changed in the test versus things that might have been affected by the change, and then just general things I want to check across the whole application. And I allocated a certain amount of time. Here's some categories I'd break them up into, these three that I just showed you. So again, pulling out the Excel skills, I thought, well, how about if I say, when a change is made, I'm going to go ahead and allocate 25% of the time that I've got to just checking the change itself. I'm going to allocate 50% of the time to those things that were related to the change. So if it's password change, then I'm going to probably check everything related to authentication. This is the place I would do it. And then my regression, again, is going to cover all other aspects of the application, carts and things like that, that I would want to ensure are still not broken. Most of you are already doing some sort of budgeting, probably like this with your time, maybe not. But you can see how, if we go back to what we learned in some of the previous screens, if we start to determine how long a certain test takes, and we know we're given 4 hours, well, these numbers start to work out pretty well. We can say, well, we're going to give an hour for direct testing, an hour for regression, and we're going to give 2 hours for related testing. And all of that because we did our homework ahead of time and wrote that stuff down. These are just some good starting numbers. I'm sure you'll refine them over time. So again, kind of taking Excel and pushing it a little bit harder. I just created a simple, some additional columns and some calculations here. And I said, well, let's go ahead and I'll put an X in the things that I'm going to do during my direct testing, my related testing, and my regression. Comes up with some totals down below. Some of these columns just go on and on forever as I started to do to determine how much time it would take. So you can see I've determined 5 minutes collectively over there for one of them, and 10, and it sums it up in the bottom. And I've basically, in the lower right corner, you'll see time. I've basically come up with a way to estimate how long would it take me to do this testing. And you and I both know there's going to be a little bit of fudge factor in there. Maybe you pad it with another 10% for just interruptions and that sort of thing. Again, we're more into some of the more advanced things, so this isn't something you have to do tomorrow, but it's sure fun to play with these values once you really get in there. I started to do a little bit more on this and created this little time budgeter, and I put in how much time I had, and you can see how it divided everything up and how much time was still available. So for, again, those of you that love Excel, you're going to love playing around with this sort of data, and you're likely your manager is going to love it too, because it's going to show a lot of intentionality and a lot of strategy behind what you're deciding to test. So now everything's in place, and you've got this limited time frame, but you're ready to to determine the test you're going to run, and you're off. You're running with this functional test metrics, all kind of initially based on the initial METS grid. Um, so as a review, we're getting kind of close to wrapping some things up here. Create the physical test grid first or the functional test grid. You can flip these. Don't feel like you can't do that. After you get those done, consider breaking these out in a different format. This graphic doesn't look real great. It's kind of pixelated here, but you get the idea that this is the one where you basically take this data and you break it out in a longer format here in Excel, and you put the category here. And then you go ahead and create the grid, kind of like we did back here. That's the step right here. And then you factor your time budgeter. All that started just because we were able to organize our test in this way to begin with. So this is pretty far down the road, and you're probably going to be pretty committed once you get this deep into it. But you'd be surprised how many QA managers love the idea of a strategy like this, especially in something like Excel that mostly just costs them time of their engineers to build the tool out. So I have found it really well received in multiple companies I've worked for. So yeah, we're about the right time here. I'm going to have some Q&A here in a minute. Some parting thoughts. Remember that when you're deciding to incorporate METS, it can really enhance the existing test strategy you have. It's a great strategy for to being prepared when those things get thrown over the wall. Go ahead and begin to build METS grids with what you already know. Even if it seems like it's incomplete, I have found even by adding a few tests there, kind of begins the process and kind of gets the machine going. Consider using something, by the way, like Google Sheets, and then it's really easy to collaborate. Or if you're using Office 365, their version of Excel makes this really easy to collaborate collectively as a team. You're going to find that each grid is going to provide some new insights you didn't realize, like maybe you don't have good test coverage for a certain functional area of an application. This is going to raise awareness to it and help you to identify gaps in your test planning. And strive for this idea to continue to let it evolve. So make it easy to get in there and add to it, knowing that you're not going to get everything the first go around, but that you've made it really easy to enhance as time goes on. So take your first steps, and by all means, go out there and download, the free samples I've got online. It'd be crazy to miss those. Even if that's all you did for now is use some of the web ones that are already existing. Print out some of the blank worksheets. I have about 40 of these I walk around with all the time as I'm working with my test engineering team. We sit down and we basically do some proof of concepts, and we use these to kind of flesh out new applications that are coming and just think about what would it look like if we built out a test strategy using this. It's been really effective for our team, and I think you'll find that as well. So this is kind of my last slide for the talk, and we're going to open it up into some Q&A here. It looks like some questions are starting to come in. Let's see. Hey, Martin, do you want to jump in here at any point, or how do you want to do questions from this point?
Yeah, I think we can just start with the questions we have on the chat.
Okay.
So there's one from Alfredo. Would this be beneficial on Agile Scrum methodology? We can start with this one.
Yeah, we run a very agile shop where we're at. We found this works very well. By the way, you'll be surprised how many of the devs and the product owners want to get their hands on this thing, and they want to see it once you start to build it. So I think you'll find it very beneficial. Our devs and our product owners really seem to love it as well. By the way, I'll tell you one other thing we found. We have found some of our business folks that work in the area of marketing have taken these same principles and applied it to their development process as well. to make sure that it's almost like a unit test for the work that they do, but it's a checklist that they can look at and say, did we cover all the important things like call to action and those sort of things? So it applies well into other areas of the business.
Okay, thank you. Then there's a question, I think that's from Facebook. Are you considering building a tool to automate all the Excel entries?
That's been brought up many times. I would
I'm
love
sure you've
to do
never
that.
been asked that before.
No, believe it or not, I think you could still get the app on the iTunes store that I built. It's nothing more than the web version of the METS spreadsheet, but I have had more than one person ask to build that tool. I have dabbled with it way back in an Objective-C for iOS. And it's come up many times. It's just I want to make sure it's something it could be maintained in the long run. So we've even considered doing something in an open source space like that.
Maybe a follow-up from my side. How much value do you think such a tool could add, or is the Excel spreadsheet already helpful enough? Like, what would you like to see in such a tool?
Yeah,
that makes it more useful.
That's a great question. You know what? It is funny the way that you brought that up. Have you ever noticed that sometimes there's a temptation to create a tool that already exists out there? And the fact is that Excel does a pretty good job at spreadsheet type work. So it'd be dumb to create another spreadsheet tool at this point with Google Sheets and Excel out there. Where people have wanted to add or bring in an application perspective is maybe when they're moving things around. You still have to be pretty good at Excel at knowing how to insert a column and maybe spanning things. I don't find that all that difficult, but if you're working with a team that's really new to working with spreadsheets, they might find that a little bit of challenge.
Okay, thanks. Next one is why less budget for direct tests compared to related testing? What is the difference between related test and regression test? From
I think they're very similar. So again, this methodology is evolving even as I'm learning more about test engineering. I'm currently taking my team through ISTQB training for CTFL. Any of you who've done that, and I'll tell you, there's no better way of learning something than to teach it. So I'm with you. I think that these are very similar to regression. Early on, when I started to develop it, I thought of related testing as things that could have been impacted because they were very near a change. And when I think of regression testing, I think of it a little bit broader than that, but I can see those two worlds overlapping very easy now.
Okay, next one from does it take a lot of time and effort to write down the time required per test item, as the test items could be pretty granular?
No, not really. And once my management started to see the value of it, they really loved it, so they encouraged it. I think the idea is don't feel like you have to solve all of these problems at one sitting. Let this be a living document. So when you get into the section related to your blog, let's say, or your authentication, that's the time you capture that data. So, and once you capture it, do your best to estimate what it took. Don't be unrealistic in that because that could bite you down the road. But I think you're going to find it's helpful to have there, and people are going to love that you can give them an estimate. All right, you still there? Let's see.
Oh, sorry, I was mute. Would it sometimes feel better to actually test the items than spend time writing down the details? It's a question we got.
But it sometimes feel better to actually test the items.
So I think the question is about like the balance between coming up with a test plan versus doing the actual testing.
Ah, well, this is a fundamental of test engineering. So what you're asking is, should you document your testing? I think that when I think about the types of documentation I've encountered as a test engineer, many of us have. Um, some of us know that there's a tendency to create a phone book of test cases that never see the light of the day. Sometimes we're even incentivized to write test cases like that. What I love about METS is when you create, let's just call it a test case name, like in the background on my screen here, you can actually see some of them back there. When you write down that critical test name, for some of us, that's enough to go ahead and know what I need to perform for the test. Now we require our test engineers to document all critical, followed by high test. Medium and lows don't always get documented, but the reason we do that is all their critical tests become candidates for my team to automate. So they're incentivized to do it. I think that's what we're getting at is with that question is, why not just test stuff? Why write it down? I hope, I hope I hope that's not what the person meant, but that's common in our field. I believe in documentation. Let's just put it that way.
Okay, thank you. Then we have a question from Lamui is, wait, I see this METS strategy is more applicable for UI testing or for QA manual testing. And I think in the same direction, there is a question from Ivan. Can this be applied for automation testing for API tests?
Yes, it can actually. And our team is actually working on that right now. We're learning on a whole language how we document API testing, but we're going to go ahead and build out a METS methodology for it because it gives us prioritization for API. So this is meant to be applicable to UI. That's where it started. And now we're finding it can evolve into other areas of testing just as easily. And like I said a moment ago, it's a fantastic tool to work along with your automation engineers because now it begins to bring prioritization of what's the most important thing for them to automate. Any of you have heard me on Test Talks with Joe Colantonio. You know I'm not a fan of automating everything. I just don't see the ROI in it. So to me, go ahead and automate the things that are most critical at the end of the day, and those become the candidates. We ensure are good automation candidates, but at least now they've been identified through your METS grid.
Okay, then there's one more question. Do you know how many people are using METS? Any interesting companies that are using it?
There are a number. There's some companies over in Europe using it. I really don't know if I should share those company names, but they would be. That's being used in the travel industry. It's being used in retail, and some of these big box stores. And we're using it at my company. I get notes all the time from people that are using it, so it is getting used quite a bit out there. And I'm continuing to evolve it. So I'm actually working on what I would consider kind of the next gen of this, and that is I'm starting to flip some of the things I'm learning, which I talked about in the presentation, flipping. So you focus primarily on the functional versus the physical grids. The physical grids tend to be more generic, and they can be applied towards broad technologies like maybe database testing, let's say, or something like that. Whereas the functional ones tend to be more tied, they can still be tied to types of applications, but they tend to be more tied to the application you're working on and not as portable. But actually, in some cases, they can be very portable if they're generic, like an e-commerce solution.
Thank you. Then we have a question from Abi. How does METS work with the need to document test cases at a detailed level, which is required to automate them?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I didn't really cover that in this talk, but what we do in the spreadsheet, all of you know you can add a tab into the spreadsheet. So we think of each category as a test suite. So let's think about authentication for a moment. Let's imagine we had a category called authentication for an e-commerce solution. And maybe we had a critical test. Can, a user authenticate? Can they change a password? Some of the basic things we all work with every day. Well, once we've identified that category, we go ahead and create a tab in the spreadsheet. And we actually started off with the letters TS for test suite, and it'd be called TS auth, let's say, or authentication. And in there will be those 3 test cases in that single next tab of that spreadsheet, built out in the traditional way. Most of us have probably built test cases, which is individual test steps, 1 per line with the test step number and the details. Enter, for user ID, enter this. For password, enter this. Click, log in, or whatever the steps are that you have. We actually require our test engineers, our manual test engineers, own their test strategy, their METS test strategy. They have to have those documented before they come to my team for requesting them to be automated, because we need some sort of guide in order to automate their application from. Many automation many automation engineers will go ahead and essentially act like the test engineer and try to derive the test case. But if there's no test case written down and the automated test fails, how do you know what's the problem? Is it the problem with the automation, or is the application changed? So when we do it in this way, when the automation fails, the next thing that we do, other than run a second run just to ensure it's just not a hiccup or a flaky test, is we run the manual test case. And from there we derive, we really found a defect, and that's worked out exceptional for us.
Awesome. Thanks for the answer, and thanks, Abi, for the question.
Excellent question.
We have one more from Premraj. How does Matz work to handle or document test coverage?
Well, that's a good question. I think test coverage is kind of a funny thing, because I wonder if we're considering test coverage along with code coverage. I think what METS does do along the idea of test coverage is when you begin to have a category and you realize you've only got 1 critical test coverage of it, you have no high, medium, and lows, you don't have more than 1 critical, you probably have a pretty thin area of test coverage there. So just the visual aspect of looking at the test grid is going to at least indicate, hey, these areas are lighter than these others. So someone is just looking at it and realizing just from the obvious that we don't have great coverage here, but we have broad coverage here. So that's the way we generally do it, and our managers are very aware of it. They look at these test plans all the time with our test engineers, and they ask about those gaps and why we've added some new feature, but we have no coverage there at all. We might not even have a category. So those might be the goal for the next week before the meeting is go ahead and let's build out your METS there and get your manual test cases, at least your criticals, built out by next week. It's worked out really well.
Okay, thank you. If we don't have any more questions, guys, if anyone still wants to ask something, please just put it on the, oh yeah, we have one more. A test strategy may not include only physical and functional, but non-functional aspects like performance, availability, security, and so on. Do you have examples for these as well?
I don't yet, but I sure love that question. It's a great next lead in. Whoever wrote that question is going to love that book I shared as well. So you're thinking right in the right lines. You can see how this way of thinking can evolve in a lot of different areas around a non-functional testing. Around security would be an exceptional one for sure. So maybe around performance and areas like that. So I don't have any examples of that yet, but it doesn't mean they're not coming.
So I guess Abi will need to wait for the book.
Yeah, you can do it and share it with me. I'd love to see how it comes out.
All right, thank you very much. Yeah, I think that's all we have for Q&A. So good. Thanks everyone for joining. Thank you so much, Greg, for giving this great presentation.
You're welcome. I'd love for your folks to be able to, if they're interested, connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm very easy to find out there. Remember, metstesting.com. You're going to find all these resources for free out there. And any of you interested in automation, take a look at my book. It's really the why of automation, not necessarily the how, but I share a lot of my experience there, and I hope it will help you as well. So it'd be great to connect with some of you online as well.
All right, thanks again. And we want to ask everyone to provide some feedback for this webinar. So I shared the link on the Zoom chat as well. So everyone who participated could spend a minute to give us some feedback, which will help us to plan for the next sessions that we're going to have. And also please follow the TAQELAH group on Facebook to stay updated on our next events. So thanks everyone. Thank you, Greg.
Wonderful.
And yeah,
great to spend time with you tonight, or I guess this morning for you all. It's nighttime here. Thanks for having me, everybody.
For making it work.
Absolutely.
All right.
Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.